Hello, I'm Sarah Kay Bierle with Emerging Civil War, and today I am being joined by a good friend, Cindy Brochure, and I met her when I was speaking to the Brunswick, North Carolina Civil War Roundtable, and we had a lovely chat. And in the course of our discussion, I found out that Cindy was involved in some grassroots battlefield preservation efforts. So I just want to jump in and hear your story on that. And maybe we can start with, how did you get interested in history and how did that lead you to rediscovering this battlefield?
Okay, I'll try to be brief because it's such a long, lengthy story on how it took place, and I probably don't remember all of it. I guess I've always been interested in history. My dad was World War II. My great grandfather, believe it or not, was a Civil War soldier, and he was buried I grew up in the county in North Carolina, and his graveyard was behind our home place. So
Wow.
Dad would take me back and tell me, "There's my grandfather," and that whole 9 yards. And I knew he fought in the Civil War, and that intrigued me as a child. So as I grew up, I just kept that love for history. And then one day, me and three other ladies, my friends, who also loved history. We were all genealogists as well. We did family histories. We're sitting around a table and we learned that um, there was a part of the Kinston Battlefield. There was Battle of Kinston. I believe it was 1862, if my memory serves me right. And we learned that someone had come before the city council to have it rezoned so they could put uh, low income homes, not or some kind of clustered homes types on it.
Right.
And we knew it was a meal. I can't remember the name of the meal now, but the battle was right there, the heat of the battle. And so we just decided to educate ourselves so we could educate the town council. And me and Jane proceeded to do that. So we lobbied, up until they were having to have a special use permit because it was not zoned what they wanted to do. Long story short, we won the battle. They did not zone the property. And to this day, if I'm not mistaken, that area and that property is preserved. I'm not sure if the family still owns it or if someone else preserved it. Excuse me here, my computer keeps blinking on and off. Um, and that was known as the Battle of Kinston,
Okay.
which, by the way, the Confederates won that battle. I believe it was Burnside was coming in. Sarah, you're better at the past history than I am. Was that when he went into Virginia, or uh, there was a terrible defeat for the Union? It was around the same time. So Kinston um, was kind of quiet for that battle because they didn't really want the North to know they had not necessarily won. But
Right.
it was kind of interesting, and we were proud of that. But to be able to do that, we had to get involved with preserving the battlefields, and that's where the journey started. Was
Wow.
from somebody wanting to rezone property.
Right. And that's amazing. And I think you had shared that you had done some historical research and then presented that to the city council basically to help establish. And it was you and your friends. And right there, ladies leading the grassroots movement there for the preservation of Kingston Battlefield.
All four ladies, we were called three hippies and three widows and a hippie. I was the hippie, they were the widows, but we all had that special in our heart for preservation. Just didn't want to see the property destroyed. So we, not knowing we couldn't do anything, we did stuff. I mean, I look back on it now, I think, how did we do that? And Jane told me the other day after I talked to her, she's the one I wanted to help with the interview until she got sick. Um, was my mentor, and she says because we didn't know we couldn't, and that's honest truth. So we called Battlefield Preservation. I think it's named something different now in DC, and they helped us along the way. They came down, surveyed the battlefield, and the National Park Service Battlefield Protection Program. We started with them, and it just today you go to Kinston, North Carolina, you're going to see two battlefields that are interpreted. You'll see an old church that still had the bullet holes that had been moved to the battlefield. So it was quite an adventure, but well worth it.
And that's
One of the
amazing.
most, yeah, one of the most interesting things that happened is that we actually preserved a huge tract of very pristine earthworks
Mm.
that were in a family since the man that owned the property's grandfather
Wow.
was a Civil War soldier and he was killed during the Civil War. So
Hmm.
they had special meaning to him. So he always protected them.
Wow.
Somehow, after months and months and months of visiting and describing how we'd like to protect them, and all this historic preservation group was able to buy the earthworks from the gentleman. And they're still preserved today. There'll never be, of course, you have when you get we got a grant
Hmm.
from Ed Turner. He had set up after he did Gods and Generals, he had set up a fund to fund battlefield protection
Right.
after the movie. So I don't remember what we paid for it, but I think we had $100,000 grant from them. So
That's amazing. And for our viewers who will be watching this video, we'll put links for the battlefield sites that we're talking about that you can visit. We'll put those in the video description and in the blog post, so you will be able to follow up and find out how you can go and visit these sites later on. So you had mentioned that you were able to get grants. Was that something that you and the ladies were doing, or was that something that American Battlefield Trust was helping with a little more exclusively? I'm just curious because having gone through a little bit of grant process on my own, that is such a big job.
it is a big job. And when we sat around the table at my kitchen table back in 2001, just figuring out how we were going to get petitions to sign to say don't rezone this property and stuff like that, we said, okay, well, we're going to form a nonprofit because I think it was Noah who was at the Battlefield Preservation Trust at that time, and he told us form a nonprofit. So we said, okay, well, we're going to form a nonprofit, not knowing how to form one, and we had no money. And there were four ladies. We sat around the table. Jane said, "I'll be the president," or I think we might have volunteered her. Jan, who was the other person, one of the widows, said, "I'll be the secretary. I mean, I'll be the vice president because they never have to do anything." And Pat was the secretary. She said, "I love to write." This is how grassroots it was. And I go, "Great, I can be the treasurer," and I hate numbers. I hate bank.
Uh-oh.
I hate accounting. I hate. So I'll be the treasurer because we had $0. Um, I believe, if memory serves me, I believe the Civil War Roundtable in London sent us around $700 to file for our nonprofit. I wrote it, had a little bit of legal experience, and so I wrote the nonprofit, and that's how we formed. Um, when I resigned and moved to Oak Island, I guess about 5 years later, we had 5 bank accounts and 3 grants in process. And the reason we had 5 bank accounts is because like I said, I wasn't good with numbers. So every time we had a grant, I was paranoid that I would mix something up and I would open it would be a sub account under our account. So every grant had its own bank. So, and I did okay, I guess. They were finally all finished and held. We did them for different things. The Golden Leaf in North Carolina gave us several grants as well.
So what was your nonprofit called?
Historical Preservation Group.
Okay.
And we named it that so we could be generic and do many things. And we did. We set up a round table under it. There's a colonial commission because Kinston, Lenore County was full of colonial history. I'm trying to think what else. I know there was Civil War Battlefield Roundtable. I mean, there was Civil War Roundtable. There's a Colonial Commission. I believe there was a genealogical arm to that as well.
And does the nonprofit still exist, or
It,
has it changed into something else?
it still exists.
Okay.
We of course I resigned, Jan resigned because we both got busy in other parts of our life, but Jane's still president. She's been the president since we formed in around 2001, and she will remain the president until somebody comes along that's willing to take it on. But over the years, they have, we did a lot before I left Kinston, but after I left, it just kept growing and growing and blossoming. We got a museum there that holds the CSS News. Really, I don't know if you've ever heard the CSS News, but it was scuttled down the Battle Wise Fort So the Yankees wouldn't take it and use it. The Confederates actually blew it up, and it was an ironclad.
Oh, okay.
And it was in Kinston, and they pulled it out of the river, I think, in the 1960s, somewhere in there.
Hmm.
And the whole of it had been under shelter for years and years and years. And Jan, who was on our group, and Jane and me and Pat, and we had two men on board at this time. And Ted and Alton Stafford, who was a shipbuilder, had dreamed of reconstructing the CSS News 2. We call it CSS2. Believe it or not, it took many years and a lot of headaches. But those men if you go to Kinston, North Carolina right now, you will see a replica, true replica, size, materials, everything, all by grassroots in the community, no government money, built a reproduction of an ironclad. And you can walk 2 blocks over and see the actual hull of that ironclad.
Wow.
There's a museum there.
That's
So it
so
started a
amazing.
whole movement of preservation.
It did, and it started from an interest in the land and a meeting around a kitchen table. It's such a classic American story
Yeah.
about preserving parts of our history, and it's so amazing. And I find it very inspiring. So thank you for sharing those parts of it. Now, I think when we had talked before, you had shared that you worked for local or county tourism. Was that right?
Yes.
Um, Go ahead.
In Kinston, I was assistant executive director.
Okay.
And then I was the director of tourism and marketing for the city of Southport, both very historic towns, right up my alley. You give me tourism, you give me history, I can make a tourism program from it. And basically that's what we did in Kinston, and that's what we've done everywhere I've been. Kinston had it. They just didn't put it all in one box and tie a ribbon around it. And I knew how to do that. So that's what I did. And from that point on, it grew. And the tourism arm in Kinston had grant money that they could loan too. So we developed a way to do grants, and everybody was fair and everybody could apply. And it kind of built it like a roadblock, like you're building blocks, and it built the preservation arm and the historical tourism arm in Kinston County.
Right.
So,
And that's something that I know we talk about frequently with some of our partners at Emerging Civil War, is that historic preservation and this historic tourism go hand in hand. And it's so great when a local community can really embrace that and see that it has benefits for the local businesses. And people coming to the history sites means people coming to the county or the city, to explore more.
yeah, what grows around that are antique stores, specialty shops, restaurants. All of that comes along with that, and it took. Let's see, it probably took 15 years to get it to where it's at now, maybe 16.
Sure.
But if those four ladies around that table had never started, some of it may have happened, but we pushed. I mean, we really were the driving force and pushed. And got everybody excited about it. And we had help from the local community.
Sure.
The local newspaper, Lee Rayner, she loved writing the stories. So every week she'd do a historical story. And they still today, I sent you the, what was it? The news where Jane Phillips writes an article form about the history of Kinston whenever she feels like it. I mean, people love that. They love the history. It doesn't even matter what part of history, as long as it's history.
Right. And what do you find from your experiences? What brings people to that love of history? Is it like the general intrigue of the past? Is it ancestors? Like, what do you observe, or what have you observed?
It's a good question. I think the people around me that I've observed, it's just a love for how we got to where we are in America today, what made us America. Mine was a lot of ancestry. James is also a genealogist, so ours was based a lot on already doing all our family history and knowing, you feel close. If you're a genealogist and you start doing your family history, that's why ancestry is so big. There's a spirit there that just drives you. Jane, I don't know, Sarah, if you've heard of the Kinston hangings. Have you ever heard of those?
When we chatted a few weeks
Yeah.
ago.
I'm not going to go into detail, but Jane, who is my mentor and the president of Historic Preservation Group, had an uncle that was hanged. And
Oh, wow.
that was one they considered a traitor, and the Confederate Army hanged him. Um, so she already had that spirit of wanting to know more. And we did. We found out a lot more about that than we could imagine. I think it was 13 men they hanged that at that one time in front of all the other troops to make an example. And they were North Carolina boys, so very sad.
So they were North Carolinians who were accused of wanting to go over to the federal side. Just trying to make sure I'm understanding it.
Kinston and New Bern are 30 miles apart. New
Okay.
Bern was held by the Union Army from 1862. Kinston was held by the Confederate, and there was horseshoe shape. If you come out of 10 miles from New Bern, there was a horseshoe of camps. If you came 10 miles out of Lenore County or Kinston, there was a horseshoe of Confederate, horseshoe of Union. And if you could drag yourself that 10 miles and you were a slave, the Union Army, you were free. Well, everybody knows North Carolina was the last to succeed. Not everybody in North Carolina were sympathetic to the Confederate cause.
Right.
In fact, there were a great deal of them on the East Coast and the water coastal areas that were not. And these boys had decided to be home guards, the ones and it was called Nethercutt's Company. And it's got great information on the internet, and I can send you some links when we're through.
Okay.
But they decided they would join or be constricted. And they joined, but they were promised that they could stay home and be home guards. Well, I think Burnside had an awful battle and lost or something. There was something going on, and they gave orders to go to Richmond. And when they did, they said, "Wait a minute, we can walk about 5 miles over to the Union line, and we can stay right here in our county," because it was all border counties. And that's what they did. And the Union, when you read the story, if you ever get a chance, the Union put them on the outskirts in that horseshoe shape, 10 miles out of New Bern, to guard. So when Pickett came down, he was going to take New Bern back, and they captured a group of men. They thought they were Union soldiers until they brought them back to camp. And then other soldiers said, "Excuse us, Mr. Pickett, Officer Pickett," or General. I don't think he was a general at the time.
Right.
These guys are not Union. These guys are Confederate traitors. So that became a battle in the records on whether it was Union or whether it was Confederate traitors or Union prisoners of war. Confederates won the battle. You know, they had the trial and decided they were the traitors.
Huh.
Anyway,
Interesting.
I have found in the records when we were researching it, the wives filed for both pensions, Confederate and Union. And we went to several graves right there in North Carolina on the coastal area, and the tombstones were Union tombstones. So it's kind of different. It's a great human interest story because these guys all had families and children and buried.
That the women filed for both pensions. I mean, technically that could work. That's it. That's very creative.
They would just get, it was 30, 40 years after the war when the pensions came. So
yeah, trying to survive. What a story.
Exactly. And I forgot the number that were buried under the gallows, but not all family came and got them. I mean, some were buried there. So it's a pretty interesting story.
Yes, lots of history to explore for sure.
Yeah. I'm having trouble hearing you a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let's see if I
might
can.
Be mine.
I can speak up a little bit. Hopefully, it will be a little better there. So I love the quote that you shared earlier about how you didn't know that you couldn't do it, so you just went for it, and look at all that's been accomplished. Do you have any other words of inspiration for anyone, but maybe particularly ladies who are, going to be the next generation of preservation people, or people, in their community looking at what can we do to preserve, a landmark or a piece of land?
Well, grants aren't as available as they used to be. There's still a few out, but they're getting harder and harder to get. Perseverance is really the biggest word I can come up with. Just keep at it, and even if they tell you no, just keep going back. Like, for instance, the National Park Service has a grant program,
Right.
and you have to be. I think it was the most endangered, but you couldn't be so endangered that you couldn't be saved. I mean, it was very difficult to fit into that category. And the first two, I believe, 2 or 3 years we applied. We knew we were going to get it. Well, for several years we didn't get it, and then all of a sudden it was our turn. But we went to DC, and we got to know the folks at the Park Service, and they kind of mentored you through it. They were great. They said, do this, do this, do this, and maybe you'll get this, as we go down the line. So that's what we did. We took our time and energy, and we followed up with the local government. We went to the state of North Carolina and put CSS News model in the lobby. But all of that, like I said, I had no idea how to do it, but I didn't know they wouldn't let you do it. You go to the Speaker of the House in North Carolina and say, "Can I put a ship in the lobby? Can we just put this model there because we're going to want money down the road so you can have?" And they're sure, but that took lobbying. It took building relationships.
And I think it's such an example of how being local and building those relationships, whether it's with the local newspaper or then reaching out to your state representatives or things like that. I think that's such a part of the preservation saga. I see it when I'm reading about, some of the books that have been written on historic preservation in America. And that's something that frequently comes up, is just that building those connections and using them well for the preservation efforts.
Well, Civil War trails, when they decided to come through North Carolina, they'd been in Virginia for years. But when Mitch Bowman decided to bring it into North Carolina, and the state of North Carolina decided we wanted it, that really started flying, especially Civil War history. So I think we have 2 trails now. But it was a job convincing people to get that money, believe me, but it was worth it. It was worth it.
And seeing people exploring your local history. And I know we've talked about when it's a little safer to travel and I'm able to come to North Carolina. I'm looking forward to saying hello and getting to see so many of these sites that you've been sharing about. So it must be really inspiring to have people coming and seeing it and, learning the history that's in your backyard that you were able to help take steps to preserve.
Well, one thing that was really interesting, and there's so many little blocks that happened along the way, but after all this started happening, and after we saved Wise Fort Battlefield, then we turned our energy to the Kinston battle. And Jane and I would ride around all day long, who knows what, I guess looking for graveyards or something, and exploring. And we rode by the Kinston Battlefield, which was a flood area. What was the Floyd, I believe, was the flood that wiped out a lot of eastern North Carolina. I mean, total flood. And it wiped out all the homes that had been built there over the last 100 years. And FEMA was to say, no, it can't build back here. So the town goes, well, let's make it a ball field. No. We had a battlefield. They built on the battlefield. Now we have a battlefield back. And would you believe we were able to convince that the city and county of Lenoir and the city of Kinston to leave that as a battlefield preservation? And that's an interpreted park now.
Very nice.
It's amazing. I mean, like I said, we just said, oh, wow, that was the battlefield. Oh, take me to the mayor, and that's how we kind of did it. Honest to God, it was just, I look back on it, it was just probably stupid now that I'm more knowledgeable in life, but I like being naive. I liked it before. Now I've learned too much on how government works. I don't know if I like it as much.
Right. But sometimes in those moments when we are naive, there can be those big breakthroughs that we look back on and it's like, wow, that was amazing. So
yep, it was. And nobody's probably heard of King's Barbecue, but behind King's Barbecue was part of the battlefield. And the owner's son, Will, was very historically minded. And unfortunately, we lost Will to a death. And that that right there also played into it, because the father said, well, don't give flowers, send the money, historic preservation group. So we went from $0 to thousands of dollars in like a week. And we built parks and monuments and all kinds of stuff. So you never know. Once you start, it kind of starts just growing.
Exactly.
Plant a seed.
Right. So do you, in the area where you and the historic preservation group have worked, do you have a favorite place that you like to go for a walk or to sit and contemplate?
Well, you got the Neuse River in Lenore County. And nothing's any prettier than walking along that river with all those pretty trees hanging over. So that's a pretty good place. And I used to love to go to the earthworks. I've been down in the bottom of the earthworks, and because you used to, and I'm sure you still could find a lot of relics, and by digging, they don't let them do it. We don't allow that to happen.
Of
But
course.
I've seen garages full of stuff from all these battlefields in Lenore County.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of amazing when you have 30 miles apart, the Union and the Confederate, and just a little southern town.
Absolutely. A
Yeah,
story there that holds a lot of history, and it sounds like a lot to explore still. So,
it is. It is. And when I moved to Oak Island, I kind of thought, well, that's it. That chapter's closed. But you
mm-hmm.
never lose that love. You never lose that love for history.
Mm-hmm.
So if I don't have something to do, I go find something to do. Some mystery to solve.
Right. So are you working on something now that you're able to share or would like to share as we're starting to wrap up?
Well, my passion from about the same time has been the Washington family from Kinston. And you didn't grow up in the South, but I grew up in the South, where I lived by my aunts and uncles and cousins, and none of them went more than 30 miles from home. Well, when I started, we dug up a body, or Dr. Ewing at East Carolina did an archaeological dig looking for our first governor, Richard Caswell. This is a very long story. Didn't find Richard, but we found the body in an iron casket that was buried in around 1850s. So long story short, they dug the body, took it to 2 years later after the Smithsonian heard that we had it. By the way, Dr. Ewing made us put it all back because it wasn't Richard Caswell.
Is
Long
this
story.
okay to record or do I need to cut this part of the interview
No,
out?
you're fine. You're
Okay.
fine. He made us put it all back. That was he said, I got good news and bad news. This is a body from around 1850s. And if we could open it, everything in it would be preserved. It had 3 brick tops and was lined with handmade brick. We knew somebody big was in that tomb, and he had to put it back. So 2 years later, the Smithsonian learned that we had a pristine casket, that they wanted to know what the atmosphere was like in Lenore County in the 1850s. Long story short, we sent it to DC. They discovered a woman in the casket. And her name, we didn't know the name at the time, but through years of research, it's Louisa Hernandez Washington, who was the daughter of Joseph Hernandez, who was the first senator from the state from Florida when Florida became state. He was the hero of the Seminole War, Joseph Hernandez. It was his daughter Louisa, but she married George Washington. So it's a long story, but this whole family is going to someday be a book. I don't know when, and maybe not my lifetime, but I mean, they went to Yale and Harvard. I mean, went to Europe to study medicine. It was that, I guess, what fascinated me. I didn't know people in North Carolina did things like that. So
The more we learn, and
the more you learn, the more you want. Yeah.
exactly.
The more water you drink, the more thirsty you get. Never heard that? You drink a lot of water, you're going to want more, and that's the problem. And with, oh my gosh, with internet now and DNA, wow, sky's the limit. You can really do some research now. No more little microfilm page by page. You don't know those years though. You're too young.
I have used microfilm. There were some things that weren't, some records that I needed to look at and they weren't digitized. So I have used microfilm.
Oh, good for you. Do you have an interest in preservation, or you just like history? Well, I guess
I have I am definitely interested in preservation. I first learned about battlefield preservation when I was 14 years old, and I learned about it through the Wilderness Walmart situation at Wilderness Battlefield. Um,
Yeah.
and so that was my first introduction to it. And up to that point, I hadn't realized that there was battlefield land outside the national parks that needed saving. I kind of had this very narrow mindset. Um, Maybe a little excusable because I was 14, but that was my introduction to preservation. And then I couldn't always support financially. You don't make a whole lot babysitting in high school. But I was always interested and I would always tell people and support preservation as I could. And now I have the privilege to work with Central Virginia Battlefields Trust on their staff. So I'm very enthusiastic about preservation and hearing other stories about those that have been working on it for in the decades before and the progress that's been made and just recording those stories because there's the history of what happened on the land, which is so vitally important.
True.
But I think another piece of that story with each preservation project is who are the people working on it, who is the entire groups that came together to help save these lands and who was spearheading the efforts and things like that. So that's when I heard about your story about ladies gathered around a kitchen
Yeah.
table. Like, I need more details on this. And I
Oh,
think
well, that's about all the detail that were. I think we had soup that night because they would all come and eat, but it was just that simple. And every day after that, Jane and I would work and work and work, and Pat and Jan filled their duties, but we pushed and wrote and seek grants and talked to people. That's the perseverance that comes in that I might not have as much as I used to.
well, I want to personally thank you. And if you could pass my thanks to the other ladies that you're still in contact with as well. Thank you for doing that. And thank you for sharing your story today. And I hope that sometime either later this year or maybe next year, I will be able to come see these earthworks and these sites that you ladies helped to preserve and got the community rallying around. So thank
Sounds
you
great.
so much
You
for
have my
taking.
number. Call me anytime.
Will do.
Thank you, Sarah. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Cindy.